In the vast tapestry of biblical prophets, one name often goes unnoticed: Amos. Yet, his story and message are anything but ordinary. He wasn't born into a family of prophets, nor did he hold a prestigious position in society. Amos was a simple shepherd, a dresser of sycamore fig trees, living a quiet life in the rural town of Tekoa, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. However, it was this humble background that made him the perfect vessel for a divine mission. A mission that would shake a nation to its core, confronting the moral decay and spiritual emptiness that had taken root among God's chosen people. This is the story of how an ordinary man was chosen by God to deliver an extraordinary message. If you always want to be in tune with the word of the Lord, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and hit the like button. Everyone who watches this video will be extremely blessed. Comment Amen if you believe in God's action, and let's go to the video. In the days of Amos, the kingdom of Israel was experiencing a golden age of prosperity. The economy was booming, borders were expanding, and wealth seemed to flow endlessly into the land. Yet beneath this facade of success, a cancer was spreading: corruption, injustice, and idolatry. The rich exploited the poor, the powerful oppressed the weak, and the worship of God had become nothing more than empty rituals. It was in this context that God called Amos to step out of the shadows and speak truth to power. He wasn't a scholar or a priest. He was an outsider, armed with nothing but a burning conviction and a message that would challenge the very foundations of Israel's society. Amos stood against kings and priests, against the wealthy and the elite, proclaiming a message of judgment that still echoes through history. But why Amos? What made this simple man from Tekoa the chosen voice of God in such a turbulent time? Perhaps it was his unshakable faith, his willingness to stand for righteousness, even when it meant standing alone. Or maybe it was his raw, unfiltered approach, his refusal to sugarcoat the truth. Amos didn't come with eloquent speeches or flowery words. He came with a divine urgency, a message that demanded repentance, change, and a return to true worship. He wasn't there to comfort the comfortable. He was there to confront the complacent. Today we embark on a journey to uncover the life, prophecies, and profound impact of Amos. We'll dive deep into his powerful words, explore the cultural and spiritual climate of his time, and understand how his fearless stand against corruption and injustice makes his message as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. So, if you're ready to be challenged, inspired, and awakened by the story of a man who dared to defy the status quo in the name of truth, then stay with us as we unravel the incredible journey of Amos, the prophet who stood up against a nation's sin. Amos wasn't a figure of prestige or prominence. He was an everyman, rooted in the soil of hard work and simplicity. Born in the small village of Tekoa, south of Jerusalem, Amos made his living as a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore fig trees. He wasn't from a lineage of prophets, nor did he have any formal religious training. In fact, he would have been considered an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the circles of the elite or the learned. But it was precisely this ordinariness that made him the perfect choice for an extraordinary mission. You see, God has a way of choosing the unexpected, using the simple to confound the wise, and this is what makes Amos's story so compelling. Amos spent his days in the fields, tending to his flock and carefully cultivating the sycamore figs, living a life far removed from the political and religious centers of power. His life was humble, and his concerns were grounded in the everyday struggles of survival, family, and faith. However, it was in this quiet existence that God saw a heart ready to obey, a man who would not be swayed by wealth, power, or prestige. Amos didn't seek fame, and he certainly didn't seek a prophetic role. Yet God called him from his life of simplicity to become a voice that would challenge kings, priests, and an entire nation. Imagine the courage it took for Amos, a shepherd, to step into the role of a prophet. He wasn't just crossing geographical boundaries when he traveled from Judah to Israel. He was crossing societal and cultural barriers that would have seemed insurmountable. He wasn't polished, he wasn't a professional, and he had no title to lean on. But he had something far more valuable: a message from God. This simple man would soon stand before the most powerful and influential people in Israel, delivering a message that was both uncomfortable and uncompromising. He wasn't there to please anyone. He was there to deliver the truth. What makes Amos even more remarkable is his unwavering commitment to his calling. He knew he would face rejection, hostility, and possibly even violence. Yet, he never hesitated, never wavered. He understood that his mission was not about seeking approval, but about fulfilling a divine purpose. Amos didn't rely on his own strength or eloquence. He relied on the authority of the one who sent him. And that's why his words carried such weight, cutting through the pretense and hypocrisy that had taken root in the hearts of Israel's leaders and people. His life reminds us that God doesn't look for the qualified, He qualifies the called. Amos's story isn't just about a man stepping into a role he never sought. It's about the transformative power of answering God's call, even when it disrupts everything you know. It's a testament to how God can use anyone, regardless of their background, education, or social status, to accomplish His purpose. Amos's journey from a shepherd in the fields to a prophet confronting a nation shows us that true greatness is found not in titles or positions, but in obedience and faithfulness to God's call. In Amos's time, Israel was experiencing an era of unprecedented prosperity and expansion. Under the reign of King Jeroboam II, the kingdom flourished economically, and wealth flowed into the nation like never before. Cities grew in splendor, the elite enjoyed luxuries, and there was an outward appearance of success and stability. But beneath this glittering facade, a much darker reality was festering. It was a time when material wealth masked spiritual poverty, and the nation, despite its riches, was spiritually bankrupt. The people of Israel had grown complacent, arrogant, and indifferent to the suffering around them, and it was precisely into this environment that Amos was sent. Amos arrived with a message that shattered the illusion of Israel's prosperity. The wealth that the people of Israel celebrated had been built on the backs of the poor and oppressed. Justice had been sold to the highest bidder, and the powerful exploited the powerless with impunity. The rich grew richer while the poor were stripped of their dignity and rights. The courts were corrupt, bribery was rampant, and those who sought justice were silenced or pushed aside. Amos condemned this injustice, not as a social activist but as a voice of God, declaring that true prosperity could never exist where oppression and corruption ruled. The worship practices in Israel were another target of Amos's prophetic words. Despite their wealth, the Israelites still attended religious ceremonies, offered sacrifices, and celebrated festivals. But these acts of worship were hollow, empty rituals that had lost all meaning. The people believed they could appease God with burnt offerings and tithes, while their hearts remained far from Him. They failed to understand that God desired righteousness and justice, not mere religious observance. Amos boldly declared, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me." Amos 5:21. It was a chilling reminder that God is not impressed by outward displays of devotion when the inner heart is corrupted. The contrast between Israel's outward prosperity and its inward decay is one of the most striking aspects of Amos's message. While the nation boasted of its economic success, it had lost sight of what truly mattered. Amos exposed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to be God's chosen people, while simultaneously trampling on the values that God Himself had established. The leaders and the wealthy basked in their success, convinced that their prosperity was a sign of God's favor, but Amos came to remind them that their wealth would not shield them from divine judgment. Amos's words were a direct challenge to a society that had become intoxicated by its own success. He didn't just criticize their actions. He revealed the heart behind those actions, a heart that had grown cold, callous, and self-centered. He reminded Israel that God's blessings are never meant to be hoarded or used to exploit others, but are given to bless and uplift those around us. The people had forgotten their responsibility to care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, and in doing so, they had forsaken their covenant with God. This was why Amos was sent, to pull back the curtain and reveal the truth, to strip away the pretense and expose the rot that had taken hold of the nation. His message was not one of comfort, but of conviction, urging Israel to wake up from its delusion before it was too late. The prosperity they celebrated would soon become the very thing that condemned them if they did not turn back to God. Amos's words, though harsh, were an act of divine mercy. a final warning to a nation teetering on the brink of disaster. Amos's prophetic mission was anchored in a powerful call for justice and righteousness, two virtues that were desperately lacking in Israel at the time. His words weren't just a critique of society. They were a divine indictment against a nation that had abandoned the very principles upon which it was founded. Justice and righteousness, according to Amos, were not just ideals, but the very heartbeat of God's covenant with his people. He confronted Israel with a truth they had long forgotten, that genuine worship of God could never be separated from the pursuit of justice and fairness in daily life. One of Amos's most striking declarations was, "But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Amos 5:24. This image is not just poetic, it's a powerful representation of what God desires. Justice was to be as abundant and unstoppable as a mighty river, flowing continuously without end, cleansing the land of corruption and wrongdoing. Righteousness, like an unfailing stream, should be a constant, life-giving force that nourishes the land and its people. For Amos, justice wasn't something that could be compartmentalized. It was to be the foundation of every action, every decision, and every relationship. Amos's message hit hard because it exposed the hypocrisy of the Israelites' religious practices. While they brought offerings to the altar and sang songs of worship, they ignored the cries of the poor and the oppressed. Their acts of devotion were hollow, mere performances that had no bearing on how they treated others. Amos made it clear that God was not interested in rituals that were divorced from real, tangible acts of love and compassion. True righteousness, he insisted, is reflected not in how often one visits the temple, but in how one treats their neighbor, especially the most vulnerable in society. Amos also took aim at the wealthy and powerful who manipulated the system to their advantage. He condemned those who trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land. Amos 8:4. The prophet didn't mince words. He called out the injustice head-on, making it clear that God saw every act of exploitation, every bribe taken, and every false measure used to cheat others. These injustices were not merely social issues. They were spiritual failures that demonstrated how far Israel had drifted from God's commands. The powerful message of Amos was that justice is not an optional extra in the life of faith. It is central to it. He reminded the people that God's character is inherently just, and those who claim to follow him must also reflect his justice in their dealings with others. The prophet stood as a voice for the voiceless, championing the cause of those who had been silenced by an unjust system. He declared that God's concern for the oppressed was not something that could be ignored or brushed aside. It was a central tenet of his covenant with his people. Amos's call for righteousness also addressed the false sense of security that the Israelites felt in their prosperity. They believed that their wealth and religious observances would protect them from judgment, but Amos shattered that illusion. He warned that God's judgment would come like a roaring lion, not sparing those who had turned a blind eye to injustice. In this, Amos challenged not just the actions of Israel, but their very mindset, urging them to wake up from their complacency and recognize that true security could only be found in aligning themselves with God's will. Ultimately, Amos's message of justice and righteousness was a call to return to the heart of God. It was an invitation to live out the values that God himself embodies, values that demand integrity, compassion, and a relentless pursuit of fairness. His words were not just for Israel, but for all who claim to know God, reminding them that a faith that is divorced from justice is no faith at all. Amos, in his journey as a prophet, was given two profound and haunting visions that symbolized the fate of Israel: the vision of the plumb line and the vision of the basket of ripe fruit. These visions were not mere metaphors. They were divine revelations that vividly portrayed the impending judgment on a nation that had drifted far from God's standards. Each vision was a stark warning, a divine mirror held up to Israel's face, reflecting their moral decay and spiritual unfaithfulness. The first vision, the plumb line, is one of the most striking images in Amos's prophetic journey. In Amos 7:7-8, the prophet describes seeing the Lord standing by a wall that was built true to a plumb line, with a plumb line in his hand. For those unfamiliar, a plumb line is a simple tool used by builders to ensure that structures are perfectly vertical, straight, and aligned. It represents a standard, an unyielding measure of what is right and true. In this vision, God was essentially showing that he was measuring Israel against his divine standard of righteousness and justice. What's crucial about this vision is that the wall, representing Israel, was once straight, built according to God's principles. But over time, it had become crooked, no longer aligning with the divine plumb line. This imagery conveyed a powerful message. Israel had deviated from God's path, straying from his laws and commands. The plumb line was a declaration that God would no longer overlook their injustices and transgressions. His patience had reached its limit, and judgment was now inevitable. This vision was a reminder that God's standards do not change. And when a nation drifts from his truth, there comes a moment when he draws the line, refusing to tolerate any further deviation. The second vision Amos received was that of a basket of ripe fruit, described in Amos 8:1-2. In this vision, the Lord showed Amos a basket filled with summer fruit that was fully ripened, ready to be eaten. On the surface, this might seem like a pleasant image, but its implications were far more severe. The Hebrew word for ripe fruit is closely related to the word for end. In other words, this vision symbolized that Israel was at the end of its grace period, and the time for judgment had fully ripened, just like the fruit in the basket. The significance of this vision is that ripe fruit, once at its peak, quickly begins to rot. It reaches a point where there's no going back, and that's precisely where Israel stood. They had reached the zenith of their disobedience and corruption, and now, the period of divine patience was over. The vision of the ripe fruit declared that judgment was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent, unavoidable, and about to unfold. God's message to Amos was clear. The time for repentance had passed, and the consequences of their actions would now come to fruition. Both visions, the plumb line and the basket of ripe fruit, served as sobering reminders of God's unwavering standards and his intolerance for sin. The plumb line revealed that God had measured Israel and found them wanting, no longer in alignment with his laws. The basket of ripe fruit confirmed that their time was up, and they would face the consequences of their rebellion and disregard for justice. These visions were not just warnings, they were declarations that Israel's fate was sealed unless they took immediate and drastic steps to return to God. Amos, carrying the weight of these visions, delivered this hard truth to a complacent and unrepentant nation. The people had lulled themselves into a false sense of security, believing that their prosperity and religious rituals would protect them. But these visions shattered that illusion, exposing the spiritual rot that had taken hold of the nation. They underscored that God's judgment is not arbitrary. It's measured, precise, and based on his righteous standards. These prophetic visions challenge us to examine our own lives and societies. They remind us that God's expectations haven't changed. Just as he used the plumb line to measure Israel, he measures us today. Are we living in alignment with his standards of justice, mercy, and righteousness? Or have we, like Israel, allowed corruption, hypocrisy, and spiritual decay to take root? These visions stand as eternal warnings that God sees all, and there comes a time when he calls us to account. As Amos fearlessly delivered his prophetic messages, he inevitably attracted the attention and ire of Israel's powerful elite, most notably the priest Amaziah. This confrontation wasn't just a clash between two men, it was a collision between truth and corruption, divine calling and human arrogance. Amaziah represented the established religious and political order, while Amos stood as the voice of an uncompromising God, determined to expose the rot that had infiltrated every level of Israelite society. Amaziah was the high priest of Bethel, one of the most significant religious centers in Israel. This sanctuary, once meant to be a place of genuine worship, had transformed into a symbol of Israel's hypocrisy and false piety. It had become a center of empty rituals, where the people offered sacrifices and observed festivals, all while their hearts remained far from God. Amaziah, as the chief religious authority, was deeply invested in maintaining this status quo. For him, Amos was not just a nuisance, but a direct threat to the power structure that benefited the elite. When Amos boldly declared God's judgment against Israel, including prophecies of the nation's destruction and King Jeroboam's downfall, Amaziah could no longer remain silent. He went straight to King Jeroboam with a report that twisted Amos's words, portraying him as a dangerous conspirator trying to undermine the king's authority. Amaziah accused Amos of treason, stating, "Amos is raising a conspiracy against you in the very heart of Israel. The land cannot bear all his words." Amos 7:10. By framing Amos as a political agitator rather than a divinely appointed prophet, Amaziah sought to silence him, using fear and manipulation to protect his own interests. But Amaziah didn't stop there. He confronted Amos directly, ordering him to leave Israel and return to Judah, the southern kingdom, where he was from. He sneered at Amos, saying, "Get out, you seer. Go back to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there, and do your prophesying there." Amos 7:12. In this dismissive statement, Amaziah revealed his disdain for Amos, viewing him as nothing more than a wandering preacher seeking to profit from his messages. By telling Amos to earn his bread elsewhere, Amaziah attempted to reduce this courageous prophet to a mere charlatan, implying that he was motivated by money rather than a divine calling. Amos's response to Amaziah, however, was as bold as it was unyielding. He didn't try to defend himself or his qualifications. Instead, he made it clear that he wasn't a prophet by profession or a member of any prophetic guild. He reminded Amaziah, "I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Amos 7:14-15. With this statement, Amos declared that his mission wasn't born from human ambition or desire. It was a divine mandate, one that he could not ignore or abandon, no matter the opposition. In this exchange, we witness the stark contrast between Amos and Amaziah. Amaziah represented a system that had become corrupt, concerned with maintaining power and wealth at the expense of truth and justice. Amos, on the other hand, embodied the humility, courage, and obedience that comes from being genuinely called by God. He wasn't seeking fame, fortune, or favor. He was there because God had sent him, and he would not be silenced, even by the highest authorities in the land. Amos didn't just stop at defending his calling. He went further and delivered a personal prophecy against Amaziah, exposing the consequences of his opposition to God's message. He foretold that Amaziah's wife would become a prostitute in the city, his children would die by the sword, his land would be divided up, and he himself would die in a foreign land, far from his home. This prophecy was a direct judgment on Amaziah's arrogance and his attempts to suppress God's word. It was a chilling reminder that no one, not even those in positions of power, could escape the consequences of rejecting God's truth. This confrontation between Amos and Amaziah serves as a powerful example of what happens when human authority comes face to face with divine truth. Amaziah, a man who was supposed to guide the people spiritually, had instead become an instrument of oppression, defending a corrupt system. Amos, with no formal training or status, stood firm against this corruption, armed only with the word of God. It was a battle between a man who sought to preserve his earthly power and a prophet who answered to a higher authority. Through this encounter, Amos demonstrated that God's truth would always rise above human opposition. It was a reminder to the people of Israel, and to us today, that God's message is not swayed by the opinions of the powerful, nor can it be silenced by those who fear its implications. The courage Amos displayed in this confrontation echoes through history, serving as a call to stand firm in our convictions, even when faced with overwhelming resistance. Amos was not just a prophet to Israel. His voice echoed far beyond the borders of the northern kingdom. As God's spokesperson, Amos declared judgment not only upon Israel, but also upon the surrounding nations. This aspect of his prophetic mission was a bold reminder that God's justice is universal, and no nation is exempt from accountability, regardless of their power or prestige. These prophecies against the nations showcase that God's standards of righteousness apply to all humanity, not just to his chosen people. Amos began his proclamations with a series of judgments against Israel's neighbors, creating a ripple of unease that gradually drew nearer to his primary audience. It's as if he were drawing a circle around Israel, tightening the net with each declaration. He started with Damascus, the capital of Syria, condemning them for their extreme cruelty toward Gilead. Amos vividly described how they threshed Gilead with sledges having iron teeth. Amos 1:3. This imagery painted a brutal picture of Damascus's violence, emphasizing that their actions were not mere acts of war, but atrocities that crossed the line of basic human decency. Next, Amos turned his attention to Gaza, one of the key cities of the Philistines. He condemned them for capturing entire communities and selling them into slavery. This was not just an indictment against Gaza's greed and disregard for human life, but a broader condemnation of the inhumanity of the slave trade. Amos's prophecy against Gaza highlighted that even in ancient times, God was deeply concerned with issues of human trafficking and exploitation. The divine judgment announced upon Gaza revealed that their unchecked ambition and cruelty would not go unpunished. Tyre, a wealthy and influential Phoenician city, was also not spared. Tyre had broken a covenant of brotherhood by delivering entire communities to Edom, violating a long-standing alliance. This act of betrayal and the blatant disregard for their covenant obligations drew the fierce anger of God. Amos declared that Tyre's walls would be set on fire and its strongholds would be destroyed. This was a sobering reminder that even the most prosperous and fortified nations could not escape God's judgment if they abandoned their commitments and acted unjustly. Then came the prophecy against Edom, a nation with a long history of animosity toward Israel. Amos condemned Edom for pursuing their own kin with a sword, showing no compassion and allowing their anger to rage perpetually. The intense bitterness and unrelenting hostility that characterized Edom's actions made them ripe for divine judgment. It was a stern warning that harboring hatred and perpetuating cycles of violence and vengeance would ultimately lead to one's downfall. Amos continued his prophetic journey, calling out the Ammonites for their horrific acts of brutality. They had committed unspeakable atrocities against pregnant women in Gilead to expand their borders. Such cruelty, aimed at securing territorial gain, revealed a level of depravity that deeply offended God's sense of justice. The prophecy against Ammon declared that their fortresses would be destroyed, their leaders would be exiled, and their kingdom would be shattered. It was a direct statement that no level of ambition justified the kind of violence and disregard for life they had shown. Lastly, Amos spoke against Moab, condemning them for an act that, on the surface, might seem less violent, but was equally repugnant. They had desecrated the bones of the king of Edom, burning them to lime. This was not just an act of disrespect toward a dead enemy, but a deliberate defiance of the sanctity of human dignity. By profaning the dead, Moab demonstrated a disregard for the basic principles of respect and humanity. Amos's prophecy declared that fire would consume Moab, and its leaders would be cut off, leaving no doubt that even the smallest acts of dishonor could bring forth the wrath of God. These prophecies of judgment against the nations revealed several profound truths about God's character. First, they demonstrated that God holds every nation accountable to his standards, regardless of whether they acknowledge him. Amos's words made it clear that God's sense of justice transcends national boundaries, ethnicities, and religious affiliations. Whether the sin was cruelty, betrayal, violence, or desecration, God's judgment was always directed at the heart of injustice and unrighteousness. Moreover, these declarations served as a stark warning to Israel itself. As they listened to the judgments pronounced against their neighbors, Israel might have felt a sense of satisfaction or superiority. Yet Amos's message was about to come full circle, revealing that Israel was just as guilty, if not more so, because they had violated their covenant relationship with God. In pointing out the sins of these nations, Amos was effectively holding up a mirror to Israel, forcing them to confront their own reflection and their shared culpability. The inclusion of these judgments against the nations underscored that God's justice is not just a concept confined to religious texts, but a reality that governs the entire world. Amos's prophecies were a reminder that no act of injustice goes unnoticed, no matter how powerful or untouchable a nation may seem. It reinforced that God is the ultimate judge, whose authority surpasses all human power structures, and whose verdicts are inescapable. Through these prophecies, Amos demonstrated that God's heart beats for justice, and he will not remain silent in the face of oppression, violence, and betrayal. Whether directed at the powerful city of Tyre or the war-hungry Ammonites, Each declaration served as a sobering reminder of the consequences of turning away from righteousness. And as Amos's voice grew louder, it became increasingly clear that Israel would not be exempt from the judgment they so eagerly anticipated for their enemies. In the minds of the people of Israel, the day of the Lord was often seen as a moment of great triumph and deliverance, a day when God would rise in power to crush Israel's enemies, establishing them as a beacon of righteousness among the nations. It was a time eagerly anticipated, a future event filled with hope, glory, and the ultimate display of God's favor upon His chosen people. However, Amos shattered this comforting illusion with a message that was as shocking as it was profound. The day of the Lord, he declared, would not be a day of light and salvation for Israel, but one of darkness, judgment, and devastation. Amos's declaration was revolutionary and unsettling. He warned the people that this day they longed for would be nothing like they imagined. In Amos 5:18 he asked, "Woe to you who long for the day of the Lord. Why do you long for the day of the Lord? That day will be darkness, not light." Instead of the expected celebration of victory, Amos painted a picture of terror, destruction, and despair. This prophecy was a complete reversal of Israel's expectations, a blunt reminder that their actions had consequences and that they, too, were not immune to God's judgment. The imagery Amos used to describe this day was vivid and haunting. He compared it to a man fleeing from a lion, only to encounter a bear, or someone who finally reaches the safety of their home, leans against the wall, and is bitten by a snake. Amos 5:19. This metaphor emphasized the inevitability and inescapability of God's judgment. There would be no refuge, no place to hide from the consequences of their actions. It was a stark reminder that this day was not just about divine punishment for Israel's enemies, but also for Israel itself, a nation that had grown complacent and corrupt in its prosperity. One of the most powerful aspects of Amos's message about the day of the Lord was his condemnation of Israel's hollow religious practices. Despite their rituals, sacrifices, and offerings, God was not impressed. Amos conveyed God's words with piercing clarity. I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Amos 5:21-22. This was a radical statement, cutting to the core of Israel's misplaced sense of security. They believed that their religious observances would shield them from judgment, but Amos declared that these acts were empty gestures in the absence of justice and righteousness. Amos then drove his point home with one of the most memorable verses in all of Scripture. "But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Amos 5:24. This declaration revealed what God truly desired, not rituals, sacrifices, or grand displays of devotion, but a life characterized by justice and integrity. It was a call to action, urging Israel to align their behavior with God's standards, to treat others with fairness and compassion, and to live in a way that honored the covenant they had with the Almighty. The prophet's words were a wake-up call for Israel. They could no longer hide behind their wealth, power, or religious facade. The day of the Lord would reveal the true state of their hearts, exposing their hypocrisy, greed, and injustice. Amos's prophecy emphasized that God is not swayed by outward appearances. He looks at the heart, and what he found in Israel was corruption, arrogance, and a blatant disregard for his commands. It was a sobering reality check that God's judgment was imminent, and their prosperity could not protect them from it. Amos's message about the day of the Lord also carried a universal warning. It wasn't just Israel that needed to heed this message. It was a call to all who would listen. It was a reminder that God's justice is not confined to one nation or people, but applies to all of humanity. The imagery of darkness and destruction wasn't meant to terrify Israel alone, but to serve as a stark reminder that every nation, every person, is accountable to God's standards of righteousness. The day of the Lord would be a day of reckoning for all, where the truth of each heart would be laid bare before the Creator. What made Amos's warning about the day of the Lord so profound was his emphasis on repentance and change. While the message was undoubtedly one of judgment, it was also a call to return to God. Amos wasn't merely predicting doom, he was offering a path to redemption. If the people would turn from their wicked ways, if they would embrace justice and righteousness, there was still hope. The day of the Lord, though filled with darkness, could become a catalyst for transformation, a moment where God's people would realign themselves with His will and experience His mercy. Through this unexpected and jarring prophecy, Amos challenged the very foundation of Israel's belief system. He stripped away their false sense of security, revealed the emptiness of their rituals, and exposed their failure to live up to God's standards. In doing so, he not only warned them of the impending judgment, but also offered them a chance to change, to repent, and to turn back to the God who had called them to be a light to the nations. Amos's message resounded with a powerful and unwavering call for social justice, a theme that was central to his prophetic mission. Unlike many prophets who focused solely on spiritual issues, Amos boldly confronted the societal injustices of his day, unmasking the deep-rooted corruption that had taken hold of Israel. He stood as a voice for the voiceless, exposing the exploitation of the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed by those who held power and wealth. Amos didn't shy away from speaking truth to power, no matter the consequences, because he understood that true faith in God must manifest itself in how a society treats its most vulnerable members. During a time of economic prosperity and political stability, Israel had become a land of stark contrasts. The wealthy elites lived in luxury, indulging in the finest goods, while the poor were pushed to the margins, struggling to survive. Amos described these wealthy oppressors as those who sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Amos 2:6. This vivid imagery revealed a society where justice had become a commodity, and human lives were devalued to the point of being traded for material gain. It was a chilling reminder of how far Israel had strayed from God's principles of compassion and fairness. The prophet was unflinching in his condemnation of the corrupt practices that had become commonplace among Israel's leaders, merchants, and judges. He accused them of trampling on the poor and taking bribes to pervert justice, declaring, "You who turn justice into bitterness and cast righteousness to the ground." Amos 5:7. These words cut to the heart of Israel's moral decay, highlighting how those in positions of power manipulated the system for their own benefit, exploiting the very people they were supposed to protect. Amos's message made it clear that a society that tramples on justice and righteousness cannot claim to honor God. One of the most poignant examples of Amos's call for social justice is found in his declaration, "Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Amos 5:24. This verse has become one of the most famous and enduring statements in the Bible, encapsulating the essence of Amos's prophetic mission. He wasn't merely calling for a temporary change in behavior or a superficial display of piety. He was demanding a complete transformation of society, a return to the principles of fairness, integrity, and kindness that God had commanded. For Amos, justice was not just a legal term. It was the lifeblood of a community that sought to reflect God's character. Amos's emphasis on social justice also addressed the issue of false religiosity. He challenged the people of Israel to recognize that true worship of God cannot be separated from the way they treated others. While the Israelites were diligent in offering sacrifices and attending religious festivals, their hearts were far from God's desires. They performed rituals while ignoring the plight of the downtrodden, believing that their religious observances would somehow excuse their neglect of justice. Amos, however, dismantled this misconception, declaring that God despised their empty rituals, stating, I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies." Amos 5:21. It was a sobering reminder that God cares far more about how His people treat one another than about their religious ceremonies. The prophet also took aim at the luxurious lifestyle of the wealthy, who lived in ivory palaces and drank wine from bowls while ignoring the suffering around them. He accused them of being at ease in Zion, Amos 6:1, complacent in their comfort while others suffered in poverty and injustice. This sharp rebuke was a call to action, urging those with power and resources to use them for the betterment of society rather than indulging in self-centered pleasures. Amos's words served as a wake-up call, demanding that Israel's leaders take responsibility for the welfare of their community and address the systemic injustices that had taken root. In a broader sense, Amos's message of social justice was a reflection of God's heart for humanity. Through Amos, God was revealing that He is a God who cares deeply about the oppressed, the marginalized, and the forgotten. He is a God who stands against exploitation, inequality, and corruption, and who demands that His people do the same. The prophet's call for justice was not just a social critique, it was a divine mandate, a declaration that true worship must be intertwined with acts of kindness, fairness, and compassion toward others. Amos's focus on social justice serves as a timeless reminder that faith is not merely a personal, private matter. It must impact every aspect of our lives, including how we engage with the world around us. His message challenges us to examine our own attitudes toward wealth, privilege, and power, and to ask ourselves whether we are truly living out the values of God's kingdom. It pushes us to confront the injustices in our own societies, to stand up for those who are oppressed, and to be voices of truth in a world that often seeks to silence them. Amos's unyielding commitment to social justice was not a message that the people of Israel wanted to hear, but it was the message they needed. It forced them to confront their own complicity in systems of oppression and challenged them to live up to their calling as God's chosen people. Through Amos, God made it clear that His love for justice was not just a concept, but a reality that His people were called to embody. And in doing so, Amos's message continues to resonate through the ages, challenging us to pursue justice, righteousness, and compassion in our own lives today. Amos's message was undeniably harsh, filled with declarations of judgment, doom, and the inevitable consequences of Israel's disobedience. But, amid the darkness and the warnings of destruction, Amos also carried a message of hope, an assurance that God's ultimate desire was not to utterly destroy His people, but to redeem and restore them. This promise of restoration served as a beacon of light, piercing through the looming shadows of judgment and offering a glimpse of God's unchanging grace and mercy. It showed that even in His righteous anger, God's heart was always inclined toward healing and reconciliation. As Amos's prophecies drew to a close, a shift occurred in his message. Suddenly, the prophet began to speak of a future day when the devastation would be reversed, and God's people would experience renewal. He proclaimed, "In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be." Amos 9:11. This was not merely a promise to repair physical structures, but a declaration that God would mend the brokenness of Israel, reviving them from the depths of despair and lifting them to a place of honor and purpose once again. This restoration wasn't just about returning to a former state of glory, it signified something far greater. God's promise to raise up the fallen shelter of David pointed to a future where Israel would not only be healed, but would become a beacon of hope and blessing for all nations. Amos's prophecy hinted at a messianic future, where a descendant of David would rise to establish a kingdom of justice, righteousness, and peace. A kingdom that would transcend the boundaries of Israel and extend God's grace to the entire world. This was a powerful reminder that, despite their failings, God had not abandoned His covenant with Israel, and that His plans for them were still infused with purpose and destiny. Amos also depicted a vision of abundance and prosperity that would accompany this restoration. He described a time when, "The days are coming," declares the Lord, "when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter, by the one treading grapes." Amos 9:13. This imagery painted a picture of a land so fertile and blessed that the harvest would be continuous, a cycle of growth and fruitfulness that would never end. The barren wilderness of judgment would be transformed into a lush garden of blessings, reflecting the fullness of God's provision and favor upon His people once they returned to Him. Moreover, this promise of restoration extended beyond just material prosperity. It was a call to a deeper spiritual renewal. Amos conveyed that God would not only restore Israel's physical fortunes, but would also rekindle their relationship with Him. The people would once again dwell securely in their land, living in harmony with God's will and experiencing the joy of His presence. This was a complete reversal of the exile and suffering that Amos had prophesied, an invitation to experience the fullness of life that comes from walking in obedience to God's commands. The promise of restoration wasn't just for the benefit of Israel, Amos's vision reached beyond national borders, envisioning a time when God's blessings would flow out from Israel to the rest of the world. He declared that all the nations who bear my name would share in this renewal, Amos 9:12. This inclusion of the Gentiles foreshadowed the global reach of God's redemptive plan, a plan that would ultimately be fulfilled through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the true Son of David. Through him, the promise of restoration found its ultimate expression, as people from every tribe, tongue, and nation were invited to be part of God's family. The hope found in Amos's message of restoration serves as a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness. Despite Israel's rebellion, despite their repeated failure to live up to his standards, God's desire was still to bring healing and restoration. This unfathomable grace revealed a God who, while just and righteous, is also deeply compassionate and merciful. A God who longs to bring his people back to himself, no matter how far they have strayed. In essence, Amos's prophecy about restoration was a divine assurance that judgment would not be the final word. Though the journey would be painful and the consequences of Israel's sins severe, God's ultimate purpose was to bring about a future where his people would thrive in his presence, free from the chains of injustice, idolatry, and oppression. It was an invitation to hope, to believe in a future where God's grace would triumph over judgment, and his love would transform what was once broken into something beautiful and whole. As we listen to the echoes of Amos's words, we're reminded that God's plan for restoration is not limited to the past or to a specific group of people. It's a promise that extends to each of us today, offering the assurance that no matter how far we've fallen or how broken we may feel, God's desire is to restore, renew, and rebuild. His grace remains as boundless as ever, ready to transform our lives and lead us into a future filled with hope, purpose, and divine favor. Amos's legacy is one that has transcended the centuries, reaching far beyond the small rural village of Tekoa where his journey began. His message, though delivered to an ancient Israelite audience, carries a timeless resonance that continues to speak to the injustices and moral challenges of our modern world. Amos was not just a prophet of his time, he was a voice that shattered the silence of complacency, calling out corruption, inequality, and hypocrisy with an intensity that still demands our attention today. One of the most profound aspects of Amos's legacy is his unwavering commitment to social justice. He dared to stand against the powerful elite of his day, exposing their exploitation of the poor and their blatant disregard for the vulnerable. In a society where wealth and status were often seen as indicators of divine favor, Amos boldly declared that true devotion to God could not be separated from justice and compassion for others. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amos 5:24. These words, spoken with conviction thousands of years ago, have become a rallying cry for countless movements that seek to bring about social change and equality. Amos's fearless confrontation of authority is another hallmark of his enduring impact. He wasn't afraid to challenge the priests, kings, and leaders who misused their power, who twisted religion to serve their own interests while ignoring the suffering of their people. His defiance of corrupt systems resonates deeply in a world where those in positions of influence often fail to uphold the principles of integrity and justice. By standing up to those who sought to silence him, Amos demonstrated that the truth must always be spoken, even when it's uncomfortable or when it comes at great personal cost. Theologically, Amos left an indelible mark on how we understand the nature of God and his expectations for humanity. He presented a vision of God that was not merely concerned with ritualistic worship or outward displays of piety, but with genuine righteousness that permeates every aspect of life. Amos challenged the notion that religious observance alone could secure divine favor, emphasizing instead that God demands a faith that is lived out through acts of mercy, kindness, and fairness. This understanding of faith, rooted in action and not merely words, has influenced countless generations of believers and remains a cornerstone of authentic spiritual practice. Amos's influence also extended to other prophets who came after him, shaping the prophetic tradition that would continue to challenge and inspire. His focus on justice and righteousness found echoes in the writings of Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah, all of whom carried forward Amos's call for societal transformation. He laid the groundwork for a prophetic voice that refused to be silenced, ensuring that the cries of the oppressed and the marginalized would always find an advocate. In many ways, Amos was a trailblazer, setting a standard for what it means to be a spokesperson for God's heart, especially in a world that often prefers comfort over confrontation. Moreover, Amos's words have found relevance beyond the context of ancient Israel, speaking into diverse cultures and eras throughout history. From the civil rights movement in the United States, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously echoed Amos's plea for justice, to contemporary struggles for human rights around the globe, his message has served as a source of inspiration for those who refuse to accept the status quo. Amos's legacy reminds us that the fight for justice is not confined to one time or place. It is an eternal pursuit that demands our attention and action. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Amos's legacy is his reminder that God's concern for humanity extends to all people, regardless of their status, nationality, or background. Amos's willingness to confront not just Israel but the surrounding nations highlighted the universality of God's standards of justice and righteousness. This global perspective challenges us to expand our understanding of compassion and fairness, recognizing that God's desire for justice is not limited to any single group, but encompasses the entirety of humanity. As we draw this journey through the life and prophecies of Amos to a close, we're left with a powerful reminder of the impact one voice can have in confronting the darkness of an entire nation. Amos was not a king, not a priest, nor a man of great social standing. He was a shepherd, a simple farmer. Yet he carried a message that shook the foundations of Israel and left a legacy that has transcended millennia. His story proves that God often chooses the most unlikely individuals to challenge corruption, injustice, and spiritual complacency. This is the essence of Amos's legacy, that in moments of deep moral decay, God raises up voices willing to speak truth, regardless of the cost. The message of Amos isn't confined to ancient Israel, it speaks directly to us today. In a world still plagued by injustice, inequality, and the exploitation of the vulnerable, Amos's call for justice and righteousness echoes across the ages, demanding that we examine our own lives and societies. Are we truly living out the values that God has called us to uphold? Are we speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves? Are we seeking to embody the principles of compassion, fairness, and integrity in our daily actions? Amos challenges us to move beyond mere words and rituals, urging us to let our faith be seen in the way we treat others, especially the marginalized and the oppressed. It's not enough to merely listen to Amos's words. We are called to respond. The courage he demonstrated in standing against the injustices of his time serves as a beacon, guiding us to confront the wrongs in our own world with the same boldness and conviction. This is a call to action, to be agents of change, to advocate for justice, and to become the voice for those who are silenced. If we truly want to honor the legacy of Amos, we must take his message to heart and allow it to transform not just our thoughts, but our actions. Now, I want to ask you, how will you respond to the message of Amos? Will you choose to ignore the injustices around you, or will you stand up as he did and become a voice for righteousness? Will you allow complacency and comfort to silence you, or will you rise to the challenge, speaking out against corruption and defending those who cannot defend themselves? The choice is yours, but remember, history is shaped by those who have the courage to act. If this message has stirred something within you, if Amos's story has inspired you to pursue justice and truth, then take a moment to reflect on how you can make a difference. Share this video, spread his message, and let others know that the call to justice is as urgent today as it was in ancient Israel. By doing so, you become part of a greater movement, a movement that seeks to bring light to a world often shrouded in darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and prophecies of Amos. If you found this story impactful, if you've been challenged, or if you've been inspired, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that brings the Word of God to life. Together, we can continue to explore these powerful narratives, learn from them, and most importantly, allow them to transform us. Remember, the true power of the Word isn't just in hearing it, it's in living it. Let's take the lessons of Amos to heart and become the changemakers that our world so desperately needs. Until next time, stay blessed and keep walking in the truth.